Today on the Wrestling Roundtable, the careers of Tito Ortiz and Fedor Emelianenko, along with the Benoit murders 5 years later. Welcome to the Wrestling Roundtable. I'm the host, Eric Santamaria. Been working in pro wrestling almost 8 years, been an MMA fan for 16, and now to introduce the rest of the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are live here in New Jersey for the Wrestling Roundtable, the sold-out Wrestling Roundtable. Introducing first, talking out of the right corner, which is your left. This man is a grappler who's won gold in regional high school wrestling. He is placed in Naga and Grappler's Quest. He represents Ronin Athletics in New York. The appropriate panelist, Robbie the Rod LeConte. His opponent, to my left, which is your right. This man is a freestyle shit talker with a 0-1 record in Battle of the Wills. He is in the chat room every Monday night at Wrestling Roundtable during Raw. Will Effin Brooks! And his last opponent, to my right, which is your left. This man is a professional wrestler representing the Hellions. He is a former NWA Force One Tag Team Champion, the American Psycho, Alex Payne! Referee in charge, Herb Dean.
All right, now that that's out of the way, we're going to get down to mixed martial arts. And yes, I know this is the Wrestling Roundtable, and sometimes I'm accused of force-feeding MMA on some of our pro wrestling fans, but...
Deal with it.
Yeah, deal with it, because a lot of pro wrestling fans, maybe they don't care about MMA, they have no interest. There is that crossover there, though. There are a lot of people who have come to us and said, we never even watched MMA or cared before you guys talked about it, and your passion really brought out that interest, and now we're into it. Frank from Tacoma, Washington, one of our biggest fans, was on the last radio show, sent this great message about how he's listened to every show we've ever done 3 times each, and he was one of those that didn't want to listen to MMA and eventually got into it, and he said he bought the Frank Mir Jr. Dos Santos pay-per-view directly because of us. We also got we got an amazing message from someone. It was the big Barsman23, which I love that name in YouTube, who said the same idea, that we turned him on to MMA, and he went to his first UFC 140 in London because of us. Thank you very much, guys. That's really cool, and I hope that everyone else is going to listen to this, because I'm sure you've heard about Fedor and Tito. So last year, we did our first career retrospective on someone from mixed martial arts, which was Randy the Natural Couture. Captain America retired last year, and now we've got 2 more retirements. There's been so many retirements this past year. A lot of big names, and 2 have gone recently. Tito Ortiz, the Huntington Beach Bad Boy, and Emelianenko Fedor. We'll be talking about him a little later on, but first up, Tito Ortiz. And it's appropriate that we cover him after we've covered Randy Couture, because those 2 are linked together too. Randy Couture was in the UFC Hall of Fame. He won the heavyweight title 3 times, the interim light heavyweight title, and 2 light heavyweight titles, so kind of 3-time champion in each division. That's an amazing record. But Tito Ortiz set records himself too, right around that time. He was only a 1-time light heavyweight champion, but he held that for 5 consecutive title defenses, a record that's still yet to be broken. Maybe it will. We'll cover that a little later on. But he set a trailblaze in mixed martial arts and UFC. So he just fought last night. We're taping the day after UFC 148, and a big career has come to an end. And he was talking in the post-fight press conference about how he's proud of everything he's done in his career and what MMA and UFC has done for him and his family. He definitely deserves to be in the UFC Hall of Fame for all the reasons I mentioned before, but what does, for maybe someone who's not familiar quite yet, just heard the name Tito Ortiz, Why does he deserve to be in UFC Hall of Fame? What does he mean to the sport?
What Joe Montana means to football, what Kobe Bryant means to basketball. He's one of the first true mixed martial artists that I saw. Someone who didn't come from a specific background. Someone that could take all these disciplines, striking and wrestling, and really truly blend them to make a great fighter. He was just a true talent. He was great on the mic, good charisma, great entrance. He had a savvy for the entertainment side of it. I think that's what brought a lot of fans in. And he was a great fighter, too.
Right. I mean, you've been watching MMA 15 years, Alex Payne, so you saw a lot of Tito Ortiz rise. And when you were saying he was one of the first, I thought you were going to say one of the first heels of MMA, because you get that label a lot. He really was a over-the-top sort of character. Personally, I think the first heel was Tank Abbott. But
I was going to say Tank Abbott.
But at least Tito won. So that's a little different.
Tito
there.
also brought fans in by his charisma. And yes, he was very talented and he was having good fights. But because of the persona he had, it was like a heel. He was bringing people in. He was probably one of the very first stars.
He transcended
Yes.
MMA or UFC at the time because he was able to relate, and people wanted like a badass to follow because a lot of people in MMA at the time were it's like plain fighter. There's no one to get behind. Tito was that personality that you wanted to hate or love, which of the two. He was calling out guys. He was making fights. He was one of the first MMA fighters to go on sports talk TV shows and help bring media attention to UFC, especially at the time frame. Who else is doing that? No one else. Tito was. He was the personality to do so. So it's fitting for someone like Tito Ortiz to be the guy to get inducted into the Hall of Fame because he's done so much from basically the grassroots for UFC, going from that little MMA company that no one wanted to give a chance to now this big superstar that it is now.
Well, I mentioned how long you've been watching. We've been watching 16 years, Rod, and you've been watching 7 years for MMA, and that's around when he was really starting to bring prominence to UFC, and that was through this hate you were talking about. That was through the feud with the Lion's Den, which really started with Guy Mezger, and then they spun it into Frank Shamrock, but not so much. But Ken Shamrock was the real fight. And you may remember they did a huge fight on Spike TV after they had been on Ultimate Fighter. Ortiz had lost the light heavyweight title to Randy Couture. But this was one of the fights that, around the time of the Ultimate Fighter, really first starting to get attention for UFC. They capitalized on that with this huge free fight. That was a big fight to have at the time. What'd you think of it?
I remember the build-up was great. I remember they had this great moment on Best Damn Sports Show, period. Luckily, Ken Shamrock was on satellite, because I would have saw, if they were in the same studio, you would have saw the free fight there. Like, it would have been brawl, it would have been great, but you could feel tension through the TV. These two legitimately hated each other, which made the fight all the more watchable. I mean, it didn't turn out to be that great, because it was the second fight that lasted a minute, but it wasn't that great. You could feel the hatred between these two guys.
I mean, you can feel the hatred in the first fight, and to
Yes.
me, the first fight was really started the new era of UFC, because here's Ken Shamrock, a guy coming back to UFC after his WWF stunt, and Tito Ortiz, this young cocky kid, calling out a whole camp, beating Guy Mezger, had the fight with Frank Shamrock, and here's Ken Shamrock. Not only are these two guys who really legit hate each other going to fight, but it's a return of a legend. So it's almost like the original, the Ultimate Fighter versus this new young guy, the new breed. The build-up was great, everything was great, and the fight was just amazing. You really saw how truly talented Tito was, a workhorse, and someone who talks about it and backs it up.
Much like Hughes and Gracie, that was like a generational sort of fight, because Ken Shamrock and his ilk represented how it was when SEG first started it.
No holds barred.
Right, this was the new breed, and they always won, didn't they?
They weren't so one-dimensional.
But those series of fights that they had, Shamrock never won one. And he probably didn't even...
He never came close.
I was about to
He
say
never
that.
came close.
Yeah, it was a completely one-sided feud. But doesn't it really show the importance of a name, of a character? Because, like I said, it was one-sided through all three fights, really. But people kept tuning in for it.
People kept tuning in because I don't know if it was him returning from WWF and he still had those fans still wanted to watch him, and yet he had compared with Tito, who was brash and was interesting, and like you said, when you watch
Best Damn Sports Show.
Thank you very much. You watch that show and you can see the agitation is getting like firing up Ken. Like, I want to see him fight Tito. I was a Ken Shamrock fan. I want to see Ken win. And I was like, I want him to shut this kid up. What happens? Tito beats his ass, and it's like, wow, he backed it up, and I started turning into a Tito Ortiz fan afterwards.
Real quick, before we go to our first break, I mentioned his long record-setting light heavyweight title run. It's been brought up recently with John Jones because he had an incredible year last year, and he defended the belt 3 times won it, and then defended it against all former light heavyweight champions. He beat Hua for the belt, he beat Quinton, then he beat Machida. And a lot of people are saying, even Ortiz himself said that John Jones is probably going to break my record. Do you think that's going to happen?
He's more than halfway there. Beat 3 past champions, Machida, Rashad, and Rampage. We'll see what happens when he goes against Dan Henderson and whoever else. I mean, this guy, within 2 years, can clean out a whole division. He's very young. He's even talked about in a few years when his body grows, even talked about a stint in heavyweight, which would be very interesting.
Wait to see that.
And yeah, I mean, this guy will be the present-day Chuck Liddell, I feel like.
It very well could happen because, and you look at the history of the light heavyweight title in UFC, and that thing for a long time became a hot
Belt.
potato.
Yeah.
Losing on first defenses, and the Machida era has begun. No, it hasn't.
But it's still the division that has one of the biggest draws.
Of course, but I'm just saying that the two that have stood in terms of longevity were Tito Ortiz and John Jones, so he very well could. But right now, we've got to go to our first break. Then when we come back, we're going to talk some more about Tito Ortiz's career, and then we'll segue into Fedor. Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. That was GoFightLive.tv. You want to get boxing, MMA, and pro wrestling? Oh yeah, and episodes of Wrestling Roundtable. We're on there too, but so is Pro Wrestling Respect. Download Pro Wrestling Respect 1 and 2, and you can also get that at highspots.com, and of course more at ProWrestlingRespect.com. But we were talking about MMA, and now we're going to move on with Orlando O'Neill. He's been an MMA fan of 6 years. And we were talking about Tito Ortiz. We're going to wrap up and move into Fedor, but I had a couple questions first. First, he had a light heavyweight title run. As I mentioned, he beat Frank Shamrock for the title at UFC 22 in September of 99, and he didn't lose it up until September 2003 against Randy Couture at UFC 44. And it was in that fight he claims that he had a back injury, and some of us have had back problems and other sort of related things that couldn't be nearly as bad as a pro fighter. So you can imagine what this guy must have gone through all this time, because he's always talking about being hurt and sore, and now he's happy to be having a normal life now, that he's not going to be fighting anymore professionally. Do you think that he's right in what he's saying, that if he hadn't gotten hurt, because he's still relatively young, maybe not in the MMA sport, but do you think he would have had a little more fight in him if he hadn't gotten hurt back in Couture's fight? Or do you think he is just making excuses?
I'm pretty sure he was hurt, but I think the MMA game has evolved so much that I'm not sure if he'd have been able to keep up with the fighters that are coming out today. Like putting him against, say, John Jones of today, I think he'd get murdered. Mm-hmm. And I think the game has evolved so much. Even though when he first came in, he was the evolved MMA fighter, I don't think he'd be able to keep up.
Well, he was also accused of ducking Chuck Liddell. They had a very infamous feud called Bad Blood. They put out a DVD of that and everything, of their 2 fights, both of which Ortiz lost too. And he was accused of ducking Chuck Liddell when they were going over the light heavyweight title, and he's always, I got an excuse now, I'm hurt, this money, this whatever. And that's what the accusation is. Do you think he was actually ducking Chuck Liddell? He did get in the cage with him twice at some point.
I think definitely the first time he was ducking Chuck. So he used to be training partners and saying, I don't think it'd be right for us, we're friends, I don't think money should come between us. And then eventually Chuck didn't feel the same way. It came to a point where he had no choice but to fight Chuck. I understand his excuse of why maybe he lost that fight with the poke in the eye, because I thought it was a pretty even fight up until that point. And that's what made the second fight so intriguing, because they kept pointing that out. But I think it was kind of an excuse.
Well, you mentioned how if he had gone in against John Jones today, he probably would get destroyed. Yeah. Well, when he returned to UFC a couple years ago on a 5 or 6 fight contract, he's only had 1 victory since then, and it was an upset against Ryan Bader. No one expected that. It was a great moment, and we'll get to great moments in a bit. But what I wanted to ask about that is, considering his record and his stock in the MMA world right now, going into last night, regardless of who won or lost, we knew he was going to get a $250,000 fee right there. And then he got Fight of the Night honors along with Forrest Griffin, so that's even more money. So even before the pay-per-view starts, he was making more money than anybody in the main event, which really sold the fight. Now, granted, it's the end of a big career with Tito Ortiz, and they should have, I think, promoted that a little bit more. But we all know Sun and Silva 2 was what sold the pay-per-view that night. And same thing when he came back, and it was, I believe, on the Velasquez-Brock card. And I'm like, this guy's making a ton of money. Now, is it justified considering his longevity in MMA? He's been fighting a long time. He's one of the founding fathers to some degree. So do you think he's earned it and that's the way it should be? Or do you think it's kind of silly that the guys who are in the title fight, who are really the main event that's selling the pay-per-view, shouldn't they be getting more than the guy who's gone one in whatever?
Yeah, they should get paid more, especially when they're selling a fight. But I think it is justifiable that he got the money he got because, again, he was one of the biggest stars in the history of the sport. He was the guy who got people going in. The numbers they did for Chuck Liddell, him and 2 was like the best pay-per-view they ever did. I think it was justified.
Well, the best pay-per-view they've ever done was 100 with Brock and GSP.
For a long time,
right.
it was Liddell,
Yeah.
Ortiz 2. And it lived up to the hype. It was a good fight and it had a great finish, even though he lost. But do I think he deserved it? Yes. He was a legit star. He brought a lot of people into the sport and was very charismatic, yes.
And he's been fighting since May 1997.
And not only that, he's been fighting the top talent in the light heavyweight division.
Right.
He hasn't just been fighting nobodies. He's been fighting Forrest Griffin, Machida, Rashad Evans. He's been fighting future champions. So I think he's been going out there against top echelon talent, and I think he deserves the pay.
And I think last year, too, really proved that he's a company guy, taking the last-minute fight with Rashad Evans in the main event and almost submitting him, too, with the same guillotine they caught Bader with. As far as the $250,000, I do think he deserved a lot, maybe $150,000. I wouldn't agree for him to be paid more than the main event, especially since everyone was talking about the main event. Yes, Tito was a great backstory, but let's say if the bantamweight title was on the line too, like it was scheduled to be, for him to be paid more than 4 people in title fights would be a little ridiculous considering his record since coming back to the UFC. A considerable amount of money, 6 figures, $250,000, I don't think so.
What were some of your favorite Tito Ortiz moments?
During a press conference, I forgot exactly which one it is. He was wearing a shirt that said, "Dana is my bitch."
At the weigh-ins at 84.
He's the only person that I could think of to ever get away with it and still be in the UFC. That shows you how cocky his persona is.
It was
But
also
that
the
shows you
last
how much
fight
of
in
a
his
talent-
contract at the time.
Yeah, but that,
How convenient.
that also shows you how much of a superstar he is that Dana would be able to take this man back who just called him out, "Dana is my bitch," on his t-shirt in front of the world.
He is a businessman.
Besides the obvious, the Ryan Bader win, that same night when he fought Machida, when he was pretty much on his way to losing the fight, and he caught Machida in a triangle, and was this close to giving Machida his first loss. And to me, that would have changed the whole spectrum of the light heavyweight division. And to go out like that, I think if he didn't try to transition to the armbar, he would have won that fight. And even Machida said that he was close to tapping.
You remember watching that at Hooters? And we were like, come on, he's almost there. Oh, it was so close. I feel weird saying this, but I did want to connect it to Couture like I mentioned before. But I loved at the end of the Couture fight when Couture was actually spanking him. Because just in terms of a story, this guy has been a 5-fight champion. He's been champion for so long and being such a complete heel asshole and scooping up people and beating them and everything. And to get his comeuppance in such a way from Randy Couture of all people, wasn't he crying afterwards? Like, he was just so embarrassed.
He knew he was beat. He knew he was beat, man. He was frustrated. That was like a coming out party for Couture as well.
Yeah, and maybe it planted the seeds. I'm not saying necessarily directly, because then it, of course, went into the Shamrock feud. But maybe it planted the seeds for the Huntington Beach Bad Boy to be a little more humble and become the people's champion like he tried being later on. So, do you have any Tito Ortiz favorite fights?
Evan Tanner at UFC 30. That fight was in Atlantic City. First round, it was over in a minute.
Yep.
He slammed him.
Like a belly-to-belly
like
suplex.
no
Bam!
tomorrow. Boom. And that just knocked him out. I just thought that was freaking awesome.
The second Chuck Liddell fight at UFC 66. Just the hype. Still to this day, there hasn't been a main event where during the referee instructions, they turned off all the lights and had the spotlight on
boxing
these two.
style, right?
Boxing style. I remember it was such a big pay-per-view. I had a party just for it.
Ken Shamrock, Tito Ortiz won. I turned it on right at the end of the third period, or quarter, whatever, period. And I remember thinking,
Round.
what are the
Quarter.
entrance? And then I remember I'm not recognizing the guy Tito Ortiz was fighting. I'm like, who is that guy? He got fucked up. And then all of a sudden they said Ken Shamrock. I'm like, what? I mean, I was a big Ken Shamrock fan, especially in his WF years, and he had so many bumps on his head that he was unrecognizable from the knees and the elbows he was receiving from Tito Ortiz. He really fucked him
But
up.
give credit to Ken Shamrock. He never gave up during that fight. He was tough.
UFC 132, when he got the surprise guillotine tap out on Ryan Bader against all odds. It did not look good going in. Bader had so much momentum, and then bam, out of nowhere. What a great feel-good win. And I remember going to the next fight he had with Rashad Evans in Philadelphia after that, and he had so much of a feel-good momentum going in, just like, yeah, because if he beats Rashad, maybe he'll get the title shot, and it'd just be a dream comeback sort of story. Not to end that way, unfortunately, but at least for that one moment, we had a little hope. But so did we, until Fabricio Verdum tapped out Fedor Emelianenko. And now we're going to talk about Fedor's career real quick because he just retired recently after a bout in Russia against Pedro Hizzo, really testing himself there. But Fedor retires now with a 34-4 record, one no contest. This guy really made himself a star when UFC was not. And he became a star without UFC because of all the fights he had in Japan and the hype, of course. But he started out in rings. He became the absolute champion in 2001. He became the last Pride heavyweight champion, and he also won the Pride 2004 heavyweight Grand Prix. Yes, he did have that one loss against Tsuyoshi Kosaka in rings, because essentially it was a bullshit finish. They didn't allow blood in rings, so he got a cut like 17 seconds in.
No one ever counted that as a loss.
I know no one counts that as a loss, but for someone who might not know what that one on his record was for all those years, it was because it was in a tournament. It probably would have been a no contest any other time, but they needed to pick a winner, so they chose the other guy. So it was really bullshit. Technically, Fedor was undefeated for a really long time. And what was great about it is, this is at a time when the heavyweight division in UFC was shit. It was Tim Sylvia leaning on people like Jeff Monson for 5 rounds, and it was really...
It was the era where a lot of the early UFC fighters ended up going to Japan and
Correct.
finding the big money there.
Right, and that's why when people say he was protected and he had a lot of freak show fights against Hungman Choi and Yuji Nagata and other sort of things like that, I'm like, yeah, but he also was fighting the top heavyweights in the world at the time.
In their prime.
In their prime. His contemporaries were Mirko Krokop at his prime, Big Nog, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira,
Mark Coleman,
Kevin Randleman. So do you think that Fedor's legacy at this point, because people say he's been exposed, he was protected, blah, blah, blah. Well, what do you think now that he's retired? Because I'm still sad.
Yeah, so I don't think his legacy is tainted, but I'm highly disappointed that he never went to the UFC. Because at the time where the UFC's heavyweight division was stacked, he could have went there and he could have proved himself, even though a lot of people will say, well, he has nothing else to prove. But if you want to be the best in the world, you're going to have to fight the best in the world. Even though he's done that before, the best in the world now were in the UFC, and he had a chance to make the most money anybody was ever going to make, but because he was a part of M1, that didn't go down, and I think that's kind of tainted for me, even though I'll give him his respect as being
They did bend over backwards to give him everything,
Oh, yeah.
but that co-promotion part is what they wouldn't budge on, and we almost got Brock and Fedor in Texas Stadium. You think it would have sold out 100,000 seats? I think so.
Oh yeah. He has like such an enigma about him.
An aura.
An aura. People talk about Anderson Silva and how if he could speak more English, he'd be a superstar because of his fighting style and his always finishing fights. But with Fedor, he speaks even less English than Anderson Silva, but yet he just has this aura about him. The way he calmly walks to the ring and then his aggressive fighting style, in a way, was basically give him the world, to give him a title shot against Brock, his first fight in. After Strikeforce stint, I don't think his legacy was what it was, like maybe 5 years ago or 3 years ago, but he still have to be considered one of the greatest heavyweights.
Right, I mean...
He doesn't have that untouchable feeling
Of course,
anymore.
I mean, but you still can't take away his streak and his longevity that he did have in the heavyweight division of Pride in its best. That being said, I did feel like, yeah, maybe he's not pushing himself in the last few fights because he's taking fucking fights against Jeff Monson and Pedro Hizzo and whatnot, like I joked about before, but still, Fedor got himself over, so to speak. He became a name that people knew who didn't watch UFC, oh, that Russian guy or whatever, without speaking English and without ever fighting in UFC. So I think that's...
He never talked trash about anybody.
Right.
He was just very calm and respectful of his opponents.
Fedor is the best heavyweight of all time. And I will say that with a smile on my face. And I know you guys said it doesn't taint his career. I don't look at Joe Montana as a Kansas City Chief. I don't look at Wayne Gretzky as a New York Ranger. He was with the Oilers when they were the shit.
You don't look at Michael Jordan as the Wizards guy.
Yeah, exactly. I look at him as the pride champion fighting and fucking up all the other heavyweights he could have possibly faced. Yes, when the UFC was stacked and he could have went there, I think he kind of knew that his time was coming to an end. Mm-hmm. Why am I going to go to UFC and get embarrassed? You know Dana White, as soon as he was lost, would have buried him after that.
I tweeted to Dana White, are you going to put him on Ultimate Fighter?
I don't blame him too much. He was the first fighter, I think, who actually didn't need a UFC. That's why he could demand all that stuff. He didn't need a UFC. He was still making millions anyway.
Yeah, he was definitely protected by the Russian mob. I mean, M1. But he did have a long career that was really good and a lot of great moments. So what were some of your favorite Fedor moments? Excuse me.
Oh, God, when he got powerbombed by Kevin Randleman on the top of his head and then transitioned into a Kimura.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I would have been knocked out. I went watching. I'm thinking I'd be paralyzed.
Humans would be.
I would have been paralyzed. Like, dude, Kevin Randleman, I give up. You win. Fuck me.
Man, right on top of his head.
I got the knockout against Andrei Arlovsky.
That's right.
Affliction. When he jumped up and he
Boom,
just dropped the
boom.
bomb on him. Boom.
I don't remember anybody getting knocked out of the air cold.
They showed the replay in slow motion, and everybody that I was watching in the room was just like, oh.
That was at Affliction Day of Reckoning 2009, and that was around the time when he was like eating UFC heavyweight champions for breakfast.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit after that when he fought Brett Rogers, and Brett Rogers was undefeated, came out of his 8-second knockout win over Andrei Arlovsky, and people thought, wow, this guy's big, he's huge,
He undefeated.
he's hungry.
He broke Fedor's nose in the first round. It looked pretty
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, and this is Fedor's entrance into the second biggest promotion. And then second round, he just came up and hit him with a right, and that was it. End of the road, and the crowd went nuts.
I loved his Tim Sylvia fight, too. The first fight in Affliction. It was like, what, 30, 40 seconds?
30, 40
It was like
seconds.
4 punches, like boom, 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 and he was down.
Choked him out.
Oh, my God.
Well, I think we covered some of our favorite Fedor fights in talking about his moments, but of course we can't not mention his fight with Mirko Krokop, because that was talked about as fight of the decade. Yeah. I thought it was very one-sided. Fedor was never in any trouble, and clearly he won unanimous decision. That was Pride Final Conflict 2005. So look that up and see one of the best heavyweights of all time. Right now, we're going to move on to pro wrestling, though, and not in quite a good way. We're going to take a look back at what we talked about on our first show ever in December 2007, but with a new perspective. It's the Benoit murders 5 years later. Fedor. Okay. All right. I don't know.
Mothership is coming home. The point is, I couldn't even recognize Ken Chandler. That was a big Ken Chandler.
that's when you had like the
What was the first fight then?
My favorite Tito moment.
Okay. Do you know what UFC it was?
The what?
Do you know what UFC it was?
I want to say.
Okay, guys.
42.
Let's get ready to go.
Yeah, that Brett Rogers fight was crazy.
Oh, I forgot.
Kimberly, take your clothes off. That's what I was thinking. I fucking hated Jason David Frank for getting her.
I still want him to come to UFC though. Like come out to the Power of this Ridge team and have half the audience.
That would be awesome.
Green Ranger.
All right, we ready to go?
I still want to see the Green Ranger fight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fuck!